All right, ladies and gentlemen, how are we doing tonight? We have a small but amazing crowd here of folks who are here to help me as we talk through Africa, sub-Saharan, specifically Africa, as we talk about it. And that's going to be one of the first things that we're going to take a look at is looking at the sub-Saharan aspect of it. Like, what is this space of Africa? What is it that we're talking about? If there is one thing that I think that our students don't know enough about, it's probably Africa. It's not something that y'all have probably covered a lot in your previous years. Beyond like maybe Egypt or something like that. It just doesn't tend to come up in most state curriculums. So it's important for us to talk about it here because you don't know as much about it. And the thing I will say about it, though, is that there's just a few major things that tend to pop up on the test, but you just never know. You know what I mean? So as we're going through this, I'm going to say kind of like mention things to you like, hey, you might want to pay attention to that one because that might be an important one for you to check out, right? So just make sure you're kind of paying attention to that. I mean, all this stuff is potentially relevant, but those in particular are relevant. As we talked about, I think before, the thing that we're looking at here is going to be what am I trying to say? Oh, these are just like regional reviews, right? So we're looking at this specific region and sort of what's going on. Obviously, some of these regions are going to have like some of the later time periods, like time period 3 and 4, are going to have a lot to do with the Europeans' involvement here. So, we're going to be talking about Europeans also, but we'll try to keep it as focused as we can here. Okay. So, Africa, right? Big continent here. And one of the things for human beings is that we tend to divide it a little bit based upon its culture and language and stuff, right? So, for example, the whole continent would be Africa. So, like if somebody said, if you had a question about Africa, right, any part of this continent would be relevant. You could talk about Madagascar if you happen to know a whole lot about Madagascar, right? But typically speaking, they're going to use better terms than that. Like they're going to be more specific about where it is and what it is they're doing. So they would likely say sub-Saharan Africa, right, or North Africa and the Middle East. We're going to talk about the Middle East a little bit later on, but the Middle East is kind of weird in that some of it is involved in that sort of northern area. Some of it isn't necessarily. So if you take a look over there on the left, you'll see that green area. Okay, so that green area are countries that are involved in the sub-Saharan Africa portion of the continent. What makes it sub-Saharan Africa? Well, there's obviously the geography aspect of it. Okay, the Sahara Desert is going to be between North Africa and South Africa down there. I don't know that I can do any. I don't really use Google Meets a lot, but yeah. So hopefully, maybe you can see my little thing here or not. But if you look right there on where the line is at the top, that is like Algeria and Libya, to say like Nigeria, that's kind of where our Sahara Desert is, right? And so the places north of that are going to be places that are Arabic speaking. They are people who are related to Arabic groups. So they are going to be, like people who are descended from Arabs, etc. And then the southern part of Africa is going to also be related to, say, like the Bantu groups or what we would call Black Africans instead. And so why is this division here, right? Well, there is interconnection between these areas, but basically throughout the history of Africa, we have a bit of a division based upon the Sahara. Okay, so we do have the Saharan Trade Network that's going to move things back and forth, right? But in the process of doing that, they're not going to have every single little bit connect as it maybe would in, say, like Europe or something, right? So, like, in parts of Europe, like Rome or the Catholic Church or whatever, even though there are some things like the Alps there's a lot more movement back and forth. Here, it's mostly just going to be trade stuff. So what we're going to find then is that North Africa is not only on the other side of this geographical divide, it also is predominant. It's exclusively Muslim, basically. It is also going to have people of Arab descent. They're going to speak Arabic languages or maybe like Berber or something like that. Whereas the southern part of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, is going to be people who are of darker skin tones. We're talking about, hey, Ethan, go ahead and mute your camera. Yeah, thanks. So we're talking about people with darker skin tones. We're talking about people related to the Bantus, groups like that who are going to be speaking Bantu languages. Excuse me, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the major division between the two. On the right, then, that bigger picture there, you can see the African transition zone. That is kind of the area where we're going between the two. I would say it's a little bit higher than that, maybe. Like we probably go into like even Burkina Faso. But those areas there are the places where, the division lines between the two. Also, make sure you understand that according to College Board, we do have some divisions of Africa as well, and they are based upon cultural, linguistic, et cetera, kind of things, right? So we're going to have West Africa. That is going to be a unique and place there. That's going to be everywhere from Senegal over to Nigeria, places like that. We have Central Africa, which would primarily be like Zaire or whatever. We have East Africa, which is a little different because it's going to have those Swahili city-states, but it also has one of the only Christian countries there with Ethiopia. And then we have Southern Africa, one of the places that has a sizable settler colony of Europeans, so that's going to be a factor there as well. It's also less settled by the Bantus. And then Madagascar is its own thing, really. I mean, you could talk about it, I guess, if you're talking about sub-Saharan Africa, but the people there are not related to Black Africans. They're actually more closely related to people from Malaysia. Oddly, it's a Indian Ocean trade thing or whatever. Also, they have a lot of lemurs, so that's good. All right. If you have any questions about those divisions there or anything, let me know. But again, if you have a question on the test that says sub-Saharan Africa, right, then that is going to be anything south of that area. That's what we kind of tend to think of as Africa, right? If it says like the Middle East or North Africa, then that's going to be the northern areas where you're talking about Arab groups. If it just says flat out Africa, then you could probably talk about any of it. The question is probably referring to Black Africa or sub-Saharan Africa, but who knows? And then if it talks about in these general areas, right, you want to make sure you're in the proper location. Because if they ask about things from Southern Africa and you talk about like Ghana getting its independence, well, Ghana's solidly in West Africa, right? Whereas the rest of that is going to be in Southern Africa. All right. Yeah. So, well, again, so North Africa and the Middle East are sort of together, right? And again, these are human terms. They're not like I'm trying to think of how to describe this. They're not like set in stone, really. You know, like you can look at Africa and say that's a continent because it has very few little connections or whatever, right? But when it comes to things like Egypt, it's a little bit in the middle, you know. So it is solidly connected historically to the Middle East, but it also does have some associations with Africa, like Southern Africa as well. Also, you don't tend to in questions divide between North Africa and the Middle East. So, like if you had a question about the Middle East, you probably don't want to go much farther than Egypt, like if that would even be a thing you could do. Most of those Middle Eastern questions are going to be about like, you know, Iraq or something like that. But alternately, if it says North Africa, it would fit within North Africa as well. So again, it would be nice to be able to give you an exact specific definition, but geographers don't agree on this subject either as to where exactly it is. All right. Well, let's get into a little bit of that history now that we've got some geography done. We're going to be doing basically 2 slides for each of these. Obviously, we can't get into every single bit of the detail here with just these little, you know, simple things that we're looking at. But we're going to try to hit the high points here and make sure that you understand the basics, the big picture here, so that when you see these things and you're curious and you don't know something about it, maybe you can go back and check it out. So one thing that's typically common to all time periods here, right? So whether it's time period 1, 2, 3, or 4, are a couple of things that we're going to see here. Now, these things will change a little bit, especially near the end of time, near the end of like the, you know, in unit 4 or whatever, or time period 4. But generally speaking, we are going to see an association with kinship systems, okay? Tribal groups, family-based, like things like rulers kind of situations and stuff like that. We're going to tend to see a diversity of religious worship, okay? So we will have traditional polytheistic religions, such as you know, kind of animistic traditions of looking at, you know, the skies and the rocks and things like this. But we will also have some Christian religion, especially out in Ethiopia, as well as in the later time periods where we have Christian missionaries from Europe coming, and also, of course, Islam. While Islam tends to be in North Africa, it is definitely a part of places that are in sub-Saharan Africa as well, though just at the very top of it there. So places like northern Nigeria would be a part of that. But again, there's a lot of different things here. It's not like in China where we have like Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism are sort of like right there and working together. Here we have a lot of kind of different perspectives, different areas of the country. And then lastly, this idea of stateless systems. Okay, this is again based around those sort of kinship systems. Kinship systems would tend to be more of a social kind of thing, whereas stateless systems would be more political, but they're related to each other. So instead of like a traditional kingship kind of situation here, they do have kings, but those kings are not based around like, I control this territory, right? Like I control that mountain, or I control this space between the rivers. Instead, the stateless system is more like I control these people, right? Like the Yoruba tribe is a part of my kingdom. So while we have maps of places like, you know, Mali or Songhai that show like specific territory, it's really more like those are the peoples who are in those regions, and those are the general areas that they are going to be based around. Okay. Hey, Greta. All right, so a couple things in time period 1, 1200 to 1450. So we got the Trans-Saharan trade route, okay? Trans-Saharan trade route there. Again, our good old-fashioned, our good friend on the internet, Salt and Golden Prophet, right? So from the south, across the Sahara Desert, they are bringing salt and gold. They are making profit off of that. On the way back then, they are importing things that they can't get from that area. So they're importing stuff like spices or finished goods or, things like that instead. One of the things that makes the Trans-Saharan trade route possible are camel saddles. And of course, camels just sort of in general, you got to have camels where you have the saddles. That'd be pretty worthless if you're just like sitting on a camel saddle with no camels. But those camel saddles are going to enable them to saddle up those camels and take all that stuff across the desert because it's very difficult to do so. One of the big groups here that is important in this time period that is related to the Trans-Saharan trade route, of course, is Mali. Okay, so remember, Mali has a historical group before it that's going to be called Ghana. It's not the same as the country of Ghana, but it's before that time period. This whole area had a number of different cities that would sort of rise and fall and be in control. So there's like Jen, and there's Timbuktu, which is the capital of Mali. Then we're going to have, I think it's Gao is the capital of Songhai. So we're going to have a couple of different things here, but these are all similar groups of people that are in this area. And so basically, as one sort of like group sort of falls apart, then another will take over and be in charge. But we typically talk about Ghana, which is before this time period. Ghana is like 900 to like 1100 or something. Then we're going to have Mali, okay, founded by Sundiata Keita, the Lion King. We have Mansa Musa, of course, who is our very famous guy, the famously wealthy dude who goes to Mecca and spends so much gold that it supposedly devalues gold across the Middle East. Their capital is the trade city of Timbuktu, famously very far away from Europe. One of the things that happens in this time period with Mali is this guy named Ibn Battuta is going to travel through this area. So Battuta is one of those guys you should really know about. He tends to pop up in like, they'll put a document on there from Battuta, or he'll just get mentioned in a question. So like, they don't necessarily ask you like, who is this guy or whatever, but you're going to see his name pop up a lot, and it's good for you to know who he is. So he is going to be traveling around this time period 1 to like time period 2. It's in that same kind of general area. He is this Muslim leader who basically just starts traveling all over the Muslim world. So he goes everywhere in the Muslim world. So he travels all the way from from Mecca all the way down here to Mali, all the way out to, I think he makes it all the way to China maybe, but I know he makes it to like India and down to Indonesia and other places like that as well. So, and as he goes along, then he is going to write down stuff that's going to let us know about those places. So famously, when he's in Mali, he talks about how like they're good Muslims here, but like, he talks about how the women there are not covered often, which is very different from his experience within the Middle East where Islam is a bit stronger. So that was very like interesting as he writes about these things. So he is kind of a Marco Polo sort of figure for the Middle East, right? I need to look up what dates he is on. I'm going to look that up as we go through this. Okay. Now, at the end of this period, then this country of Mali, for a variety of different reasons, it will fall apart, and we will have another one of these places. The city of Gao will form this new place called Songhai. Okay. So we will talk more about it when we get to period 2, because that's really when the time period is. So Ibn Battuta, he was born in 1304, and he travels from 1368 until 1369. So he's in this time period. He was a Berber Maghrebi scholar, which means he's from North Africa, explored and traveled extensively throughout Afro-Eurasia, largely in the Muslim world. Check out how far he went. This is amazing. He traveled more than any other explorer in pre-modern history. He totaled about 73,000 miles. So, for example, Zheng He traveled only about 31,000 miles, and Marco Polo, a pitiful 15,000 miles. Over the period of 30 years, he visited most of Southern Eurasia, including Central Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia. He did go to China, the Iberian Peninsula, and he wrote a book about his journey called A Gift to Those Who Contemplate the Wonders of Cities and the Marvels of Traveling, which is a hilarious name, but it's commonly known as the Rila. Yeah, I know, Greta, right? I mean, come on. Like, you thought Marco Polo was so great, but yeah. Anyway, so super important figure there, huge traveler, very important guy. Other important states and locations then in this time period, we got these Swahili city-states, also Kilwa, which are being developed here. This is not really the heyday of them, but they're still there. We also have the Hausa states. I'm going to have a map of this in just a second. The Hausa states are very close to Mali. It just kind of appears, I've never seen a question on the Hausa states, so whatever. But they do exist and could be used in one of your documents if you wanted to. Swahili city-states do come up quite often on the test. Aksum, or Ethiopia. So Aksum is sort of the earlier name of this. Eventually it becomes Ethiopian or Ethiopia. This is a Christian kingdom. It's unique because as the Muslims start traveling south trying to spread their religion, for whatever reason, Ethiopia is able to protect itself. So we have this guy Menelik the First, maybe the second, I forget. They are going to create these rock-cut churches that are very famous as well. And then all the way down in the south, we are going to have Great Zimbabwe, which is in the modern-day country of Zimbabwe. This is a famous trading city. Essentially what it did is it would get sort of like forest products or interior products and then send them to the coast over to Kilwa and places like that for them to trade. So particularly important place there. All right. Again, feel free to ask questions at any point along the way. Not just make snarky comments. I love the snarky comments, though. As many of those as you possibly can. So over there on the right is, of course, this famous picture of Mansa Musa with his gold leaf and his orb. He's contemplating the orb, which is the dumbest of all memes. But you can see him all dressed up there with his what do you call that, scepter and all that kind of stuff. This is from a very famous map there. Over on the left, you can see, if you look past the watermarks, which I left on there, terrible. But you can, this is the best map I could find of some of these things. You can see a lot of these kind of places over here, right? So for example, now this is a whole lot of different time periods. So this is like all the way up to, probably like 1700 or so. But a couple of the ones that are important here, if you look over at the top left in West Africa, you can see Ghana, which is that initial little city-state there. Then you're going to see Mali, which is that sort of, I don't know, teal or something there with Timbuktu. And then you can see Songhai is going to be a little bit bigger than that. Just to the right of that would be where the Hausa states are. You'll see it called Kanem Bornu there. That's really what that is. Ethiopia then is going to be over on the right. You can see it in that pinkish color, I guess. And then down the bottom, you can see Great Zimbabwe down there. All right. So continuing on here, just talking about like trade and culture and things like that. The Trans-Saharan trade and Indian Ocean trade through the Swahili city-states led to changes in environment and culture. So again, you're going to have like more production of certain goods or certain things. You're also going to have the expansion of Islam within this area. So both of those things are going to be particularly important. You can see in that little map there, that's a terrible map, but you can see in the map there, a map of the spread of Islam in Africa. So you can see there how it sort of comes in through Egypt, and then we'll sort of travel down through these various places by various groups. Initially, really through merchants. Remember, that's mostly how Islam spreads, though they do have a few examples of conflict, and we also, of course, have examples of a few missionaries, like the Sufis, really, more than anything. But we aren't going to see a lot of them here. We're going to mostly see Muslim merchants and others who are coming through that region. All right. Time period 2 here for us, 1450 to 1750. Like I mentioned before, we got this guy, this place Songhai, which is the predominant political entity in Africa at the beginning of this time. So it's going to be there on the west in Western Africa. It was founded by this guy named Sunni Ali. Its capital is at this place called Gao, which again is a city that had been around for a while. It has a lot of similarities to Mali. The primary thing about this state is that it sort of continues that pattern of Mali. But one of the most important things is that Sunni Ali is not only going to want people to convert to Islam, and he wants to be a good Islamic scholar and all these things. He is going to use that as a political thing to help unite his empire. Okay, so unlike say Mali, where I would say a lot, maybe the majority of people were Muslim. They didn't really base their identity of their country around it. Here, Sunni Ali is like, yes, we are a Muslim country. And through that, and through the expansion of Islam here, he is going to try to make it powerful, right? Like he's going to try to make it actually sort of, be a thing in his country. They're going to trade across the Trans-Sahara, of course. However, they are going to start to decline when Europeans begin to, that should be used, apologies, when Europeans begin to use ships to sail around the Songhai Empire. So they start sailing around it through the Portuguese and others in like 1490, 1500. And that's going to start to decline the Trans-Saharan trade route, which will weaken the Songhai. Additionally, they are not ones to get gunpowder weapons very early. So there's a group of people from Morocco who are going to invade with gunpowder weapons, and they're going to be the ones who are going to put an end to this empire because of these powerful weapons. Essentially, it's like a religious thing too. Like the Moroccans don't like the Songhai because even though they talk about being good Muslims, they are doing Islam in a way that they don't like. So they're going to put them down for that. All right. Now, Islam, as we said here, spreads rapidly at this time in both sub-Saharan Africa as well as the Swahili coast. One of the things that you need to see about this is that the distance of it is going to make it like kind of atypical, right? So in other words, as we saw with Songhai, how these people were unhappy with the way that they were doing this, the further distance from the central authority of Islam means that the ways that they're practicing Islam in places like Songhai or the Swahili coast is going to be a little different. So for example, we have, even back in the Malian times, we have examples where people talk about how the Muslims in this area were doing things slightly differently. They're building they're building mosques that were different shapes. They were interpreting Islam in a slightly different way. And so that means that their version of Islam is going to be just a little bit different than you're going to find other ways. But again, as I mentioned before, Songhai will use this as a way to unite its empire. Now, Portuguese exploration and technology leads to exploration by the Euros of the African coast. Again, that's the Caravel and Prince Henry. They will then establish a trading post empire. Remember, they can't conquer this area at this point because they don't have the military power or the people. So what they do instead is they set up these trading posts where they can trade with the interior, which eventually leads, of course, to things like the slave trade. There's initially very limited contact between Africa and the Europeans, but that will change over time. That contact is, again, mostly based around this trading post empire on the water or the previous connections with the Trans-Saharan trade route. All right. Now, next thing we're looking at here is the Columbian Exchange for period 2. This is going to have a big effect on this area as well. One thing I think people are making mistakes on maybe the SAQs or test or something. Like, you need to understand that the Columbian Exchange is a process, right? Like, not a thing. It's not like Columbus brings over these foods. He doesn't grab a bunch of wheat and come over and be like, hey, would you like this wheat? And he's the only guy that did that, right? I kept having people sort of make this assumption that it's literally Columbus doing this. The Columbian Exchange is just named after him because of his connections, right? But this is a process. Okay, so it is a process every much as globalization is a process, because globalization takes time, right? It's something that happens over time. So the same thing happens here. Some things like pigs and stuff are over there pretty quickly, but other stuff like different types of foods are going to move back and forth in here, and they're going to change the stuff over time. The Columbian Exchange is going to bring new foods to Africa. So things like the cassava are going to come over, which is going to become a staple food of Africa. But at the same time, also African food. So things like okra or, certain other things like that. But also diseases are going to go to the Americas. So things like malaria are going to move over from Africa into the Americas through the Columbian Exchange as well. Eventually, these small empires on the African coast will start to expand due to European trading. So much like we saw with the Songhai, who are powerful, we're going to see this as well. So this will eventually lead to slave trading. So this process probably starts out pretty not innocuous, because slavery is always bad, of course, as I say all the time. But it starts off probably pretty small, right? Africa had a tradition of slavery that was very minimal. It was more like if you capture somebody in battle or something, they have to live in your house and do your job or do jobs that you want them to do, stuff like that. They were still people. They had kind of rights, but they were also considered to be slaves. So what happens then is that as the Europeans are buying stuff from those African areas, they are also then eventually purchasing human beings as well. These folks were probably treated pretty well initially, right? Most of our indications, even in the early days of settlement in North America, they were not treated much differently than just sort of like an indentured servant or something. But then over time, as the growing stuff goes on, like getting sugar, stuff like that, that's going to change that a lot. That's going to cause it to turn into things like chattel slavery. Many kingdoms, again, are a part of the slave trading. So, for example, the Ashanti Empire becomes very, very powerful as a result of trading human beings for guns. Others kingdoms tried to resist. Some of them were successful, some were not. So, for example, our good friend Anna Nzinga, #girlboss, is super important for us to think about here. She is a person who is trying to resist the Portuguese and resist what they're doing. Kingdom of Congo is another example of a kingdom that was also trying to resist against slave trading. Yeah, good question. Well, the one that's important for us is really about chattel slavery, right? So we don't really necessarily have a lot of names for some of the other ones. I mean, there are a few. So, for example, like concubine slaves would be an example. A number of African women were taken to the Middle East to serve as concubines, essentially wives, right? They are legally slaves, but they probably had a fair amount of influence or whatever. Again, in African society, we have this sort of low-level version of slavery that's more like a kind of like a indentured servant or something like that as well. In the Roman Empire, we had slavery, but again, most of the places you have slavery that it exists, they have some sort of rights. Like in the Roman Empire, you could potentially purchase your freedom, which is not something that really happens in Western slavery until the very end of it, like in the 1850s or something. So mostly it's going to be that. But as far as like our historical stuff here, Q1, it's really thinking you need to think about chattel slavery, right? So this Atlantic system is slave trading for goods like tobacco and guns, and that is going to lead to this idea of chattel slavery. Chattel means property, so this is human beings as property. There is no difference between to the legal systems of the Americas and other places. There is no difference between the slaves that they are bringing over and any other piece of equipment that they have, right? Like they're literally not human beings. So mercantilism is the time period this is going on as well. So that's going to have a little bit of influence in this as well. Again, part of the reason that chattel slavery begins to exist really happens in other places. So we're not really going to cover it as much here as we will when we talk about the Americas, because that's the place where it's really occurring. But it is going to move a number of people over that area. Some changes in Africa as a result of the slave trade would include things like decreased men, because there are more men taken as slaves than women. So that's going to change the gender balance of Africa in a significant way. We'll talk more about slavery later. But again, don't forget that the major reason why they have chattel slavery is that they need human beings to work jobs that are very terrible over in the New World, like things like sugarcane plantations and stuff like that nobody wants to do. And people were dying in droves. So that's why they wanted to have people that they could abuse. All right, there she is, Anna Nzinga. I like that her crown looks like a pineapple. I don't know why, that just makes me happy, but it does. On our map over there, you can see modern day Africa with an arrow pointing to Angola. That is the area of Anna Nzinga's kingdom. Okay, so you can't see that picture too well, but the kind of like darker color area there is the kingdom of what is it, Ndongo, there on the coast. And so when she is chased out by the Portuguese, she goes to the interior area called the Kingdom of Matamba. She will then take over control of the Kingdom of Matamba, and then she will invade back into Ndongo and take over control of that as well and become the queen of both. The Kingdom of Congo there, right above it, that is the place also that is resistant to African slave trading. So they somewhat successful, somewhat not. These folks are really realize that the Europeans have a lot of authority. They have guns and things that are difficult for them to deal with. So they're going to try to treat them as best they can. So like the Kingdom of Congo is more like, we're going to like, if you want slaves, we'll give you like our prisoners or something, right? Or here's some like super low social status people. You can have them as slaves, right? But you're not taking the princes and the high important people. So, not great, like not a better system, but they're trying to resist in some ways, at least trying to set like limitations or whatever upon this this thing that they're trying to do. And they also adopt Christianity. The Kingdom of Congo does, the King of Congo, I should say, in an attempt to sort of like assuage them, be like, hey, you can't take us as slaves. We're Christians too, but it doesn't always work that way. Don't forget to chime in with any questions you may have. Maybe this is a time period or something that you just don't know enough about to ask any questions, but feel free. Questions make it go a little bit easier in some ways. It's more fun to talk about stuff that you're interested in. Now, we are talking about time period 3 here, 1750 to 1900. So this is a weird period here. Mostly what we're going to be talking about here is the exploitation of Africa. So things like imperialism, as well as some of these big businesses through industrialization are going to become important for it as well. So now we're really going to be talking a lot about Europeans and Africans and sort of how they interact with each other. So the Enlightenment leads eventually to the end of the slave trade in this era. Most places sort of early 1800s-ish. Don't forget that the slave trade is ended much earlier than slavery is. So, for example, the United States banned slavery in gosh, is it like 1812, I think, or something? It's 20 years after they signed the Constitution, so whatever that is. They are going to ban the slave trade, but of course, slavery is legal in America until 1865. Same thing also in a lot of other places, like Brazil. 1888 is when they end slavery, but they don't have slave trade by then. Again, mostly because they had replacement numbers, so they had enough people there that were living that they don't need to have it really anymore. But mostly, again, due to having enough slaves in America already, is one of the reasons that's going to end. However, as industrialization occurs in Europe, in places like Britain and Germany, they are going to start to look around the world for raw materials as well as things like markets to sell to. And they look at Africa as a key place to this. So there's a kind of a connection here, right? Remember, they can't really invade into Africa because they don't have the weaponry. They're dying of malaria and stuff like that. And so what changes here really is the industrialization causes them to have a new incentive to go to Africa, but it's also going to give them weapons and like new medicines and things that allow the Europeans to penetrate deeper into Africa than they would have been able to otherwise. So industrialization is one of the biggest historical processes to change Africa. As it begins and expands through Europe, they need more places to sell and find raw materials. Africa really fits the bill there. So we're going to start to see the beginning of these transnational businesses. They're going to be pretty small initially, but they'll kind of get bigger. One of these we've talked about before is Unilever. They're going to develop a lot of palm oil in Africa. This is stuff that's used in a lot of soaps and stuff. De Beers is a corporation that sets up in South Africa for diamonds. We're going to see the expansion of capitalism and its replacement of mercantilism. One important figure here in Southern Africa is this guy Cecil Rhodes. He's a British dude, and he is going to develop railroads and stuff for the British. So he is going to sort of like try to help do a lot of development all across Africa for that. Don't forget that these are not developments that are designed to improve Africa for Africa's sake. Okay, so we talked about this before about how these countries are at the time these colonies were set up to be extraction areas, right? So they are not building they're not building this railroad to tie between major African cities because they want Africans to be able to move back and forth. They're building a railroad into the middle of nowhere where the diamond mines are, and then they're putting those diamonds on these cars and they're taking them to coastal areas where they could offload them and sell them to the West. So that's an important thing that's going to change the nature of Africa as well. This is a modern picture. I don't know. Just thought it'd be interesting to try to give you an example. Africa has a lot of natural resources, actually, even today. Again, it's kind of weird because we think of Africa as being a developing continent, not a lot of like wealth and stuff, but they do have a lot. It's just that the nature of the combination of sort of imperialism as well as modern day poor choices or whatever ends up causing some problems. So obviously, in like 1812, they're not looking for uranium, but this is a modern picture from 2008. But there are a lot of other things on here that you can see that they're looking for. So things like, gas, oil production in the later period, like the whatever this would be, like 1880s, 1890s, maybe, or a little bit later than that. But diamonds in particular, you can see in the south part there, South Africa, Namibia, Botswana, there's a lot of that down there. See a lot of gold all over the continent. Also some other metals like copper, manganese, iron ore. These are like more like in the ground resources. Don't forget also things like palm oil and other stuff like that, as well as stuff that they're looking for to try to sell. All right. So, continuing with time period 3 here, imperialism results from the need for resources and capitalism. Okay, so part of the justifications for imperialism are racist, including for Africa. So, known as the white man's burden or social Darwinism. So, basically, as they're starting to exploit the African continent for resources and all this, they need some sort of justification as to why it's okay to do this. They're like, this is terrible. We're clearly bad people. Like, why can we justify this? And so, the idea then is that people in Africa are not as advanced as the people of Europe. So this white man's burden then is the idea that they owe it to these people to help them out, basically. Now, if they happen to help them out, they're also going to help themselves out. Well, that's just a nice thing there. So social Darwinism then it specifically is a kind of more advanced version of this, which says that the toughest, most powerful races will make their way to the top. Again, this is all just racist pseudoscience garbage. None of it is true. It's just the difference between different societies, as well as sort of like establishing one group as the key and most important group, even though they're not necessarily. Europeans in this time period are able to make it into and dominate Africa due to new technology. So one problem they always had was diseases, like they would get into Africa a little bit ways up there, and then they would all get they would all get malaria and die. So we have things like quinine that are going to help to prevent and like deal with the symptoms of malaria. They're also going to have things like bed nets and stuff too. Also weapons. So the machine guns like the Maxim gun or other repeating weapons are going to help out. Steam engines are also big, so they can build railroads into the interiors, or they can use steamships, which would also help them get further and further into Africa. One thing to remember here that's really terrible, of course, is King Leopold II. He is going to control the Belgian Congo, and he will murder millions for profits in this time period. Again, they're going to chop off hands, things like this, when people are unable to get them the resources that he is looking for. Specifically, in this case, the resource is rubber. So rubber was super important in the Industrial Revolution because you need to have like rubber things to help like if you have like two metal parts that are slamming together or whatever, having rubber in between them keeps them from grinding down or causing problems. So that's basically what they're going to use that for. So natural rubber is what they're using that for. And he was more than happy to hurt people to get that to take place. Around the same time period, then we have the Berlin Conference, which will divide the continent up by the various European powers. There are a few settler colonies that are going to be developed, and generally, well, Q1 asks, how would chopping off hands get you rubber? Well, if you are not fulfilling your if you're not fulfilling your daily quotas of rubber plants, and you see your best friend get their hands chopped off because they're not doing it either, you're going to be able to work a little harder the next day. It's just basic torture to get people to work on stuff. Yeah, well, it doesn't make sense. Also, it means that that individual is no longer able to really help you very much. So it's pretty horrifying, but that is an example. So yeah, a few settler colonies here. Most of these settler colonies are going to be in places that are less settled in a sense. So like South Africa doesn't have as many people living in it as say like, West Africa or somewhere. So like Cape Town, areas like that are where the Europeans are going to settle. But also Algeria is going to be this French colony, Kenya as well. For both of those, it was more just that Algeria was very close to France, and Kenya was just a place the British liked a whole lot. I don't really know. Many people are going to resist this imperialism in a lot of different ways. So we have two examples of military resistance here. In West Africa, we have Ya Asantewa as well as Samori Toure. I think I added an extra A on Ya Asantewa, but whatever. So she was a military leader of the Ashanti people. I say military leader. I think she was a political leader who got the military groups to do others. You probably need to look into her a little bit, but mostly just remember that she is a leader of resistance against the British. We also have Samori Toure, who is also going to be, he lives in the French controlled areas of Western Africa, and he will also fight battles against these folks. So Greta says, what would they do with people who then had no hands? Well, I mean, most of them would probably be sent out to starve to death and not allowed to work. Those who could still work, like if they were younger and could like pull carts or something, maybe they would do things like that. Like, again, I mean, it's just racist, brutal violence. Like it doesn't make a lot of sense, right? That's kind of the situation. And then, of course, sometimes so most of these military resistances did not work in the long run. So sometimes they would have things like religious attempts as well to resist. So, for example, the Xhosa cattle killing movement. Remember, this is this prophet. She's like a 14-year-old girl. I cannot remember her name, and I can't pronounce it, I think, even if I can. But she basically has this vision where she has some of her ancestors, these ghosts that come to her and say, basically, hey, you want to get rid of the white people? What you need to do is you need to sacrifice your cattle, kill them all off, and then we're going to come back and we're going to get rid of all those folks and bring your cattle back. So people do it, and of course it doesn't work. And so the Xhosa end up having starvation and lots of other problems as well. So those are examples of some ways that people were trying to resist this imperialism, specifically imperialism where they don't really have the military or other capabilities to resist instead. There's a little map for you of the Ashanti Empire about 1800. Again, the Ashanti are going to start off really being based on slave trading, but then gradually they will grow more powerful over time. So the Ashanti heartland there, and then as they get larger, their empire, they conquer these groups of people called the Fante states. You'll see along the coast there, you'll see these Dutch and British enclaves. So for example, Elmina is a Dutch slave factory is what they were called, because you had these people called factors that sold slaves. So these little like enclaves and things were places that people would bring people to sell, and then in return they would sell guns and stuff back to those groups. Yeah, Asantewa is a descendant of these people, so she is going to resist it much later on, resist European imperialism. All right, let's check out our last time period here, 1900 to the present. So around 1900, then the whole continent is basically controlled by Europeans, except for a couple of states. We have Ethiopia was never controlled by Europeans in this period. We also have what is it? Liberia and Sierra Leone, which were slave colonies. They were kind of like they're kind of like had overlords, I guess. I think Sierra Leone was actually controlled by the UK, but whatever. But still, these were places that were theoretically not controlled by Europeans. But otherwise, the whole continent was under the control of Europeans. So when World War One rolls around, a lot of imperial subjects actually fight for these empires. They kind of hope that this they might get some freedom from this. Like if the French are needing soldiers and a bunch of Algerians or a bunch of Burkina Fasans like got up and went and fought with them in the war, then maybe they would be given some freedom or they would have some sort of change based around this. But unfortunately for them, none of that was given. After the war, everything just went back to the way it was, and it was a bad situation. Now World War II rolls around then, and it's not as important in Africa. There's less of those sort of like soldiers kind of moving around necessarily. There's a little bit of it, like we have some like free French and stuff, but basically you're not going to see a lot of African soldiers fighting in this case. World War II, of course, is fought in northern Africa, so places like El Alamein, which I think is in either Libya or Egypt. There's some fighting in those kind of places, and there's like little fights other places, like some ships and stuff like that, but not as much. The only exception to that is that, but right before World War II, the Italians invade Ethiopia. So yeah, weird. They wanted to have a big, cool empire and stuff, and that was a place they thought they could attack, so that's what they did. So that's about it, though. So when that war is over, then again, remember, we're going to see a wave of decolonization. Primarily, that decolonization is going to recur because people look at World War II and all these crazy Europeans, and they're like, these guys are trying to tell us that they're better than us. Like, what the heck? Like, these dudes are like out there murdering each other. Like, it's absolutely terrible. Not to mention these countries that, like, Nazi Germany are just absolutely terrible for all kinds of reasons. So during this time period, then we're going to have decolonization, but we're also going to have a Cold War. So during the Cold War, Africa will often side with one group or the other. So, for example, we have Angola as a proxy war that's going to exist between both sides of the empire. So they're going to one side of this group is going to be funded by the USSR, the other is going to be funded by the US, and they are going to fight each other as a proxy war. We'll also see other examples of this, like some of the African states will side with some of the others. But also don't forget about the non-aligned movement, okay? Non-aligned movement is a lot of people, like led by places like Ghana and others, who don't take a position on this. They don't want to be involved in either of these two places. So again, as I mentioned before with decolonization, it's going to begin after World War II. Ghana is going to be the first major African country to get its independence from, it'll get its independence from Britain. Some countries, again, are going to fight for independence. So Algeria or Kenya. Others will negotiate. So, for example, Ghana and French West Africa. Largely, the way that you can determine this is sort of like what its value to the European country would be. So, like Algeria was a settler colony of the French, and it was very close to France, meaning they didn't want to get rid of it. Kenya, similar. They had a lot of British living there, like 500,000, and they had a lot of closeness to it, right? Or alternately, if it has a lot of like economic resources. Otherwise, though, like some of these other places like Ghana or French West Africa were just not as economically feasible in some ways. Like French West Africa is nice and it does have some like resources, but by and large, the French were probably spending more money to like police it and stuff than they were getting anything out of it, really, in a sense. So they were more willing to part ways with that country instead. And a lot of times when they're doing these negotiations, they're trying to part on good terms, because while they don't want to have military or political control of these countries, they do want to keep a lot of economic control over them. So by freeing French West Africa, the French could then become a source of materials for them instead. Okay, so that would be a reason that they would want to try to do that. All right, here's a little map for you that shows a bit of this. Colonial rule in Africa in 1914. And then over on the right, you can see sort of independence dates. So you can see in the 60s there with a lot of that area in French West Africa, a lot of the other countries there as well. Some of them don't get their independence until quite a lot later. The Portuguese states in particular, you'll see don't really get independence until the 70s. So certain places held on to it for longer than others. All right. Last little bit here for us. Last little slide here. One thing that's going to spread across this continent in the 1950s, 60s, and so forth is this idea of Pan-Africanism. Now, I think technically the Negritude movement was earlier than this, like it's early 20th century, but it would still be a part of time period 4. And they have some similarities to each other as well. So Pan-Africanism is the idea that you should highlight our similarities rather than our differences. The Negritude movement, based around Leopold Senghor, is going to be based around the idea also of like, African arts and poetry and things like that as well. On the negative sense here, and that's going to spread the continent, inspires resistance against Europeans. Apartheid in South Africa, then, white leadership will impose segregation on steroids, where they're going to literally segregate people into lots of different areas. Nelson Mandela, as well as others, and the ANC will resist. He will go to jail. And be in jail for a very long time. He ultimately becomes the first Black president after the fall of the country. We will also see a couple of other little bits here in sort of like Unit 8 and 9. So we have atrocities in Africa, including the Rwandan genocide in the 1990s, which is going to occur between the Hutus and the Tutsis. And of course, new antibiotics. This is all that globalization stuff in Unit 9. New antibiotics are going to reduce death among the African population. Other diseases will kind of step up, though. So things like Ebola or HIV/AIDS will end up having a lot of effect upon the people of Africa as well. Okay. So there is our sort of 4 time periods there that we're looking at. I'm going to go ahead and stop this sharing here. And then let's see what questions you have. Anything you would like me to go over specifically here? Just to kind of finish it off. We got about 10 minutes, 5 minutes or so. Is there anything else more specific that are like things you remember that you don't know about, or like whatever? I don't think I ever quite kind of told you some of the things that will be on the test, or that I tend to see on the test a bit. I would say probably like Mali tends to be on the test a fair amount, like that whole area there. Islam spreading throughout Africa would be one that tends to be a lot, because it's a good example of sort of like syncretism and spreading of religion. You'll see a lot about imperialism. That's just a big one they talk about a lot. Also, yeah, and decolonization would be one as well. So like those are kind of like 3 real big ones: decolonization, imperialism, probably slave trade too. Obviously, that's a big topic too. But if you're looking into like some specifics of details of those things, those would be good ones to take a look at. All right, what else we got? I don't know that that's going to come up on a test, Greta, but I like it. She asked, how did the Mandela effect relate to Nelson Mandela? Some person, I think, in like what was it, like early 2000s, for some reason had always thought that Nelson Mandela died in jail, and then she looked it up and turned out he had not, that he had actually become president of South Africa. It's okay, don't worry. And for some reason, that inspired this whole collection of people who have faulty memories, saying that things are different. So like, if you have the Berenstain versus the Berenstein Bears and all that kind of stuff. So the idea that like things changed or something like that. And that was the first one, was the Mandela thing. So that's why it's called the Mandela effect. All right. No, not really, Ethan. I mean, they kind of get pushed to the side pretty quickly. Yeah, sure, Greta. So Ethan asked about the third side in the Angolan Civil War. I mean, I can't imagine you're going to get a super specific question about the Angolan Civil War. But remember, there's a American side, Unitas. I can't remember what the acronym for the other one is. One of them's called like FLAC or something. And then there's the third one, which is kind of the middle ground sort of thing. But the middle ground group is the one that initially gets independence. So like when the Portuguese grant independence to Angola in 74, they try to put this group that's like more middle ground in there, but they don't really have a lot of political support. So pretty rapidly after they are given independence, the whole thing breaks down into civil war, and that middle side doesn't really have a lot to do necessarily. So, but yeah, I mean, I can't imagine, like, if you ended up with some sort of like question about decolonization or resistance to imperialism or something, or not, resistance to USSR or something, you could certainly talk about it. But I can't imagine that the third side would be very important. What else we got? Got a couple more minutes here. Yeah, sure, Holland. So it's not as important as you will find it in other places. Holland's asking about mercantilism in Africa. So mercantilism really is going to be a lot more about places like Americas and stuff, right? But let's remember what mercantilism is. It is a economic system, okay, and it's going to be replaced by capitalism, but it's an economic system. And functionally, what it says is that everything needs to be to the benefit of the home country, right? So the classic example is Britain. They're going to have colonies which they can exploit. So America, for example, is going to be a colony where they get like all these raw materials from, and those raw materials are going to come back to the capital, and it's going to benefit the capital. right? Like it's going to benefit them economically, etc. So the key thing about mercantilism in Africa then is that their selling of guns and things to Africa and also being a part of the slave trade is an important part of that. So the British, while they didn't have a lot of slaves themselves in Britain proper, are going to be an important factor in the slave trade. They're going to sell slaves. They're going to do those things. And the reason for that is because of mercantilism. They're trying to get slaves over to the New World to create sugar plantations and things. They're trying to make money off of that to help benefit the central authority of the government itself. So that's why they're going to do things like grant limited stock companies and stuff like that instead. Hopefully that answered it all right. What else we got? A couple more minutes here. We do have a little time if you have another question or something else that's not Africa related. Okay. Well, folks, we'll go ahead and end it there. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. I surely appreciate it. If you have any, I'm not going to sit here until 6:30 for no reason. So if you have any specific questions or anything like that, of course, let me know. The next one of these we're going to do is going to be on Sunday night, 5 to 6. That's going to be, I forget the topic. I can't remember what I said. Maybe Latin America. But whatever it is, it's going to be on, it's going to be that night. So I think it's like 5 to 6. I'll mention it tomorrow in class, and you should check it out if you can. Okay. And we'll do more of these next week. We're going to do another one on Tuesday. We'll do one on Thursday. So come on by if you can. I'm going to post this up to the YouTube channel in just a few minutes. So you can always check it out if you want to from there. Okay. Thank y'all so much. Let me know what I can do for y'all at any time. Okay. Y'all take care. Bye-bye. Absolutely.